history has shown, not just modern history, but going hundreds of years of Asians being on this continent of North America, just knowing that scapegoating, targeting, ethnic cleansing, including violence, has really been part of the heritage. And, you know, as just a decade ago, during all of the Islamophobia that has not gone away, there was a mass killing of South Asian Sikh Americans. And so, and I guess I just have to say, it's not over yet. We know from history that, you know, there's no economist who has said when they think this is going to end. And it's a global economic crisis, as well as nobody knows when the pandemic and it is going to end. And when people are suffering and miserable and in crisis, some people want to take it out on others. And we know just from our history that Asian Americans often take the brunt of that. And especially with, you know, the all of the hateful rhetoric that hasn't gone away either in some quarters. You know, the blaming of people who look Chinese, as well as the never-ending war against terror, just basically puts all Asians at risk. And that's what we're seeing today. And that's the terror, you know, of what we saw in Atlanta. Like the other, you know, millions of auto workers and people associated with the auto industry, I got laid off. I got laid off in the late 70s. There were, for those who remember, there were severe there was a severe oil crisis, actually 2 of them. And, you know, threats of going to war with different Middle Eastern countries, and the auto industry collapsed. And not only did the auto industry collapse, all of manufacturing actually in the United States stopped, you know, and these were generally pretty, you know, high-paying jobs for blue-collar work. And so sooner or later, everybody arrived at who do you blame at a time of crisis? And it was a terrible economic crisis. Throughout the United States, there was a recession that lasted a number of years and well into the 1980s. And in the Midwest, you know, when I was in Detroit, there was a terrible depression. People were, you know, the unemployment lines would wrap around the blocks for, you know, and if you could get to the front of the line, you were lucky to get $90 to last you for a couple of weeks. And so anyway, I was part of that. And I felt just, you could feel how much frustration and misery and suffering that people were going through. And who did they blame? They blamed Japan. Japan was at fault for America's problems, the economic crisis, the collapse of the industry. Why? Because Japan knew how to make fuel efficient, high quality cars, whereas the Detroit dinosaurs of those days got maybe 7 or 8 or 9 miles a gallon, and nobody could afford to drive them anymore. So Japan and anybody who looked Japanese was blamed. And you could feel that, you know, you had a target on the back of your head, and anybody who drove a Japanese-made car could get shot at on the freeway. So it was, the hatred was just, you could cut it with a knife. And so the other thing is that, of course, Germany made very fuel-efficient cars too that were highly popular. But, you know, racism doesn't work if the people, you know, look like you. So, you know, like the majority of Americans. So Japan became the scapegoat, and anybody who looked Japanese was a target. And one day, what we all felt could have happened was a Chinese American named Vincent was killed by 2 auto workers who saw him at his bachelor party at a pretty sleazy bar and said, "It's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work." And tracked him down, stalked him through the streets of Detroit, and beat his brains out into the street with a baseball bat. And that would have been terrible enough. But the judge took a look at these 2 white, you know, in court, clean-cut auto workers. There were no question that they had done it. It was witnessed by dozens of people. and said, "You're not the kind of men who should go to jail." And the city of Detroit erupted because, a majority Black city. Who are the kind of people who go to jail then for beating somebody to death with a baseball bat? And there was no question in anybody's mind, had an Asian person beaten a white person to death, with a baseball bat, they'd be in jail, and certainly a Black person as well. But for the Asian American community, and it might be hard for people now in the 2021 to even think about a time when Asian Americans didn't even consider themselves Asian American. It was not a term that was widely adopted. People identified as their ethnic, I'm Chinese, I'm Japanese, and Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, Indian, and that would be how they were organized, how they lived in their different cultural organizations. So what happened was the very small community of different Pan-Asian ethnicities came together and said, you know what happened to Vincent Chin could be any one of us. Anybody could be a target, and then the killers get off scot-free. So it was really the moment when different Asian ethnicities came together to say, what can we do about this? What do we do in a society where, when you think about racism, it's only about Black and white? And people actually said that. They would say race in America, it's just Black and white. And you'd go, well, where do Asians fit in? And as we started organizing, there was the question of, well, nobody in America thinks about Asians when they think about race or racism. Should we get involved in that discussion? How do we get involved in that? And so that was the beginning of a national civil rights movement to bring justice to Vincent Chin, but also to sort of bring into visibility and in the conversation about race in America, to bring Asian Americans into that. And, to have the idea of a Pan-Asian movement and a Pan-Asian voice. So that was the beginning of a lot of things. And when I look at today, the way, even after Atlanta and the mass killings in Atlanta, where the killer drove around for quite a while, targeting Asian businesses, targeting Asian American women, the first thing that the police say at the press conference is, "Oh, it has nothing to do with race." And that was also the attitude, in Detroit. And part of the organizing was we had to establish and do Asian American History 101 every time we talked about what happened to Vincent Chin, so that they would realize that we're part of this democracy too. So I'm sorry, that's the long answer. Well, the short but long answer to what the Vincent Chin case, almost 40 years ago. I mean, for me, as an Asian American girl growing up in New Jersey, and at a time when there were really very few Asian Americans outside of ghettos with names like Chinatown or Little Manila or, Little Tokyo and the state of Hawaii, other than that, in the other spaces of America, you really didn't see yourself that much. And and it does something when you're also so invisible and you actually see nothing of your history there. You don't know that there were, Asian American and Pacific Islanders who fought in the Civil War. You don't know, like, where did we come from? Everybody says to me, go back where you came from. And I have to say, oh, you mean New Jersey? Well, I don't want to go back there. And, I would walk around and just wonder, who walked on this ground before me? Were there any other Asian Americans? I cannot be the first one. And as I began to look into that and to see, wow, our history really does go far back. 1825, the first Chinese American was recorded being born in New York City. He was named Willie Brown. So if you were just to look at race or ethnicity, you wouldn't find him, right? There's Willie Brown, but 1825, but it goes even farther than that. I mean, the Spanish Manila galleon trade, that began in the 1500s, really had, Filipinos on ships, guiding because they were such a good seafarers, ending up in North America. And, there are settlements of like, you can find 10th generation Filipino Americans who are descendants of these Spanish galleon seafarers. And that's also true for Pacific Islanders. I mean, in the days that Hawaii was known as the Sandwich Islands, I mean, you look at the muster rolls of the Civil War, you find names of Pacific Islanders who were there in the 1800s. And, there are towns and counties and streets on the west coast of America with names like Samoa, and it's like, why do they have that name? Well, it's because there were Pacific Islanders, who were also, and Polynesians who were incredible, navigators who helped these, settler explorers find their way across the Pacific. So, so the more I found out about this, and it's all part of the global migrations, it's all part of, imperialism and capitalism, about finding places to extract resources from, the Pacific Islands, from other countries, from other people, and the international trade that took place then, including the human trafficking that took place with slavery and with indenturitude of people who were kidnapped, from different parts of Asia to work, in different sugar plantations or elsewhere. So that's a discovery for me, because like most Americans, even today, I knew nothing about my own history, the history of Asians in America. And so it was really a discovery. And I really wanted to put that in that book so that other people wouldn't be as deprived as I felt that I had been. It really made a difference for me to think, yeah, I'm walking here, in a place where nobody thinks there had been another Asian person. And in fact, for hundreds of years, there had been people. So that's what I was trying to convey there. I think that question is really about how would it change if Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were really visible in terms of other people outside of our own communities really saw us in terms of what our roots are. And of course, Pacific Islanders and Indigenous people have a very different relationship to the land and to migration than Asian Americans. But that's what I mean. If we were all really seen by each other as well, knowing our sense of belonging here, that our children had a sense of belonging, and that other people wouldn't be like, oh, you just got here yesterday, or so now you know what racism is like, you Asian American people. And or the whole idea about being always a foreigner, or that we have no real, well, what is our place in Black, brown, and white? Where do we belong in there? If we were really seen, and being seen means we have to define ourselves, we speak up about who we are, and that we don't depend on Hollywood to create who we are, then in my view, it would change everything, to this idea of a beloved community, that we would be part of a community. We wouldn't just be these Asians who just landed here yesterday, or, and they should go back where they came from. If that was rooted out, and there was a real understanding that we actually could say who we are and expect people to take that in and respect that, for our full humanity, and not just see us all as kind of all lumped together, that would be huge. And
I think you said it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you said it. You said it, Helen. The idea of to be fully human. This is the thing that is to be combated. I think it is to resist the demonization, to resist the idea of not being fully human. And we could see parts of ourselves probably in Hollywood films. We could see parts of ourselves on the covers of magazines, but they're also distorted. They're incredibly limited. Sometimes they're fantastic, but oftentimes they're, especially in the case of Asian women, hypersexualized,
Right.
or in the case of men, emasculated or hyper-violent. And while that might be it might bear some resemblance to some people some of the time, that's not who we are fully. And I think, the majority audience out there can appreciate the idea of what it means to be fully human when they see a range of characters. And I think that's what it means to be fully human. You see all of the faults as well as the pride of who you can be, to be fully seen. And I guess what it does is it raises for some questions in the present, and maybe some ways forward to think about.
At different times in the almost 40 years since Vincent Chin was killed, and that being a time of organizing where, the Asian groups, each one was too small to really have a voice. And we realized that we had to create a Pan-Asian coalition and make it multiracial, multi-class, really reach out and build unity. And I've been asked in these years, well, if something like that happened today, and I have to say what we're going through now is very much like today, how would organizing be different? Do you think Asian American communities would come together like 40 years ago? And so that is one of the differences with the, additional 20 million, AAPI people in the, as part of the American, democracy today, that brings a lot more differences too. So we're talking about disaggregation so we can understand what the differences are and the needs are of our communities, but it also means that political organizing for activists is like, how do you reach out to people, bring them together where they have very different, backgrounds, languages, and have a critical mass to stay within their own community. I mean, we have little Saigons and little Tokyos and different, and not only that, but when you talk about, for example, Chinese immigrants, it's going to be linguistic. You have a Fujian group, you have a Mandarin speaking group, you have the Toisan group. And so it's possible more and more for Asian American, especially Asian American and the immigrant communities, to stay separate and still feel that they have a sense of belonging and not needing to reach out and join together. So I think that is a challenge. And then the other thing about, unity, this came unity with groups outside of the AAPI, if you call it a coalition or the umbrella, is that in the lingo today is about allyship. And I've been in a lot of conversations about, well, how do we be allies with another group, another racial group in particular in these conversations? And it just struck me at one point that, back in the day, but, there was a time when, there was an assumption that we are part of a larger community together. There was an assumption that unity is achievable, that we can join together with other communities, and inside the word community is unity, right? And so that we're not separate, but we can work together to build that sense of unity and community. Whereas allyship is about, I'm different, you're different, you could be my neighbor, but let's see if we could be allies together, because it's not assumed that we are part of one community. And I think that's a difference. And I think where that comes from is, in these past few decades, we have really been in a very intense time of division where, highly educated institutes have studied how to keep people apart. And I mean, in Hawaii, we know the tradition of who works on a plantation and the migration, and the bringing over of different workers was specifically to keep them divided. Let's not have too many of one kind, and we throw this group with that group, they'll never come together to fight for really improving all of their lives. Well, that's been going on today in a very, very intensive way. We can see from the last election, if we, want to look at the ugliness that's gone on, just even in the past 4 years, all of that was just keeping people as divided as possible. So now we're at a point where people who are really fighting for the same thing, for justice and equity and inclusion, and to all be treated as full human beings, are now being sort of seen as, we're in different buckets, in different tribes. And it's going to be, well, can I ally with you because we're different? And I think we need to change that conversation and really think about, well, if we are all part of a community, a whole, how do we come together, work through our differences so we can really build that beloved community and unify? And I think it's a different mindset, but I think, we have to really disrupt this whole and subvert, these poisons and toxins that we've been fed, especially, in these past few decades.